I was 19 when I decided to do something that, looking back, I can only call stupid. It was the summer of 2013, a few weeks after I had finished college exams, and I was restless. My friends were busy, some had gone on holidays, others were working, and I had too much time on my hands. I wanted something different, something that would shake me out of the boredom. I don't remember where the idea came from exactly, maybe a video I watched online or a story I overheard, but it stuck with me. I wanted to camp in a graveyard for one night. There was an old cemetery outside of Bristol, tucked off a narrow country lane, the kind of place most people didn't even notice when driving past. The stone wall around it was half collapsed in places, the gate rusted and leaning. Inside, tall grass had grown up around broken headstones, and large oak trees cast heavy shadows across the ground. It wasn't a busy place, not an active cemetery anymore, just old and mostly forgotten. That's what made it appealing. It felt like I could disappear there for a night and no one would even know. I packed my cheap tent, a sleeping bag, a torch, a bottle of water, and some snacks. I set out late in the afternoon, riding my old bike down the narrow lanes until I reached the cemetery wall. The road was quiet. I leaned my bike against a tree, hauled my bag over the wall, and climbed after it. I felt a little thrill as my shoes landed in the long grass on the other side. It was still bright, but the place already felt heavier, quieter, like sound didn't travel the same once you were inside. I walked around for a while, looking for a spot to set up. The ground was uneven, many headstones leaning at odd angles, some cracked and sinking into the dirt. I found a relatively flat space near the back, under a wide oak tree that spread its branches across several graves. I pitched the tent there, the thin fabric standing out sharply against the old gray stones around it. As the sun started to drop, the place became even quieter. The occasional crow would land on a headstone or the wall, watching with black eyes before flying off. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. I sat outside the tent, eating crisps, watching the shadows stretch long across the ground. There was a strange comfort in how still everything was, but it was the kind of stillness that made every little sound jump out. The snap of a twig, the flutter of wings, the faint rustle of grass. By the time it got properly dark, I had crawled into my tent with my torch propped beside me. The thin nylon walls didn't do much to block out the night. Every time the wind pushed against the fabric, it felt like something brushing past. I lay there on my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening. At first it was just normal sounds. An owl calling in the distance, branches creaking. Then I heard what I swore were footsteps. Not steady, but irregular, as if someone was trying to move quietly through the grass. My stomach tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps would come for a few seconds, then stop. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. I told myself it could be an animal, a fox maybe, or a badger, but the weight of the steps didn't feel like that. They sounded slower, more deliberate. I reached for my torch, switched it off, and sat there in darkness, thinking maybe it was better not to give away my exact position with the light. The night pressed in harder without it, the tent walls like thin skin between me and the unknown outside. Minutes dragged by. I tried to steady my breathing, but every tiny noise made my heart thump harder. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Grass being pushed aside, a low crunch of dirt under a shoe. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was moving out there. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking, but the thought of shining my torch and seeing someone standing there froze me in place. My hands were sweating, gripping the zipper without pulling it. I lay down flat, as if making myself smaller would help. For what felt like an hour, I stayed like that, barely moving. Eventually, the footsteps faded, or at least I convinced myself they had. My eyes grew heavy, and somehow, despite the fear, I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. I woke up again to the sound of something scraping, a harsh, dragging sound, like stone against stone. It was faint, but in the silence of the graveyard, it cut through everything. I sat up slowly, my mouth dry. The sound came again, closer, then stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my torch, flicked it on, and unzipped the tent halfway. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the crooked headstones and the grass. Nothing moved. The scraping had stopped. I stepped out, holding the light in a shaking hand, sweeping it across the graves. That's when I saw it. Not a ghost, not anything supernatural. Just a man. He was crouched near one of the headstones, maybe 30 feet away, his back turned slightly. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. He wasn't visiting a grave, not at this hour, not the way he was moving. He had something in his hand, what looked like a crowbar, and he was prying at one of the smaller headstones, trying to loosen it from the ground. The sight hit me like ice water. My chest tightened, my throat went dry. He hadn't noticed me yet. I switched the torch off immediately, crouched low, and slipped back into the tent. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. This wasn't some animal. This was a man, and whatever he was doing out there at 3 in the morning wasn't right. I sat in silence, barely breathing, hoping he wouldn't come closer. Time dragged. Every second stretched into minutes. At one point I heard the scraping again, then a dull thud, then nothing. Finally, after what felt like forever, I heard steady footsteps moving away, growing fainter until the night swallowed them. I waited, frozen, for another half hour at least before I dared to move. I didn't bother packing my things properly. I shoved my sleeping bag into my pack, grabbed the torch and my phone, and bolted. I didn't even use the gate or the wall properly. I scrambled up the side, scraping my leg, and dropped down onto the road outside. I didn't look back. I grabbed my bike and pedaled as fast as I could down the empty lane, my legs burning, my breath ragged. Even when I reached the main road and the distant glow of streetlights, I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I was back home, the sky just starting to turn pale with early morning light. I never went back to that cemetery. A few days later, I read in the local paper about vandalism in graveyards around the area. Headstones broken, graves disturbed, even metal ornaments stolen. They suspected people were taking them to sell as scrap. When I saw the photos, I recognized the same spot where I had camped. The thought still chills me. I had gone there looking for a thrill, expecting silence, maybe some wildlife, maybe just my own imagination making things worse. Instead, I found something far more unsettling, another person. Someone who had no reason to be there, someone willing to tear apart a grave for a few pounds. It was a different kind of fear, colder and sharper because it was real. I learned something that night. A graveyard isn't scary because of old stones or shadows. It's scary because of who else might be there, hidden in the dark, doing things you don't want to see. And I will never, ever camp in a place like that again. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. No voices, no traffic, no city lights spilling over the horizon. Just the sound of trees swaying against each other, the air smelling sharp and damp, and the kind of quiet that presses on your ears until every small crack of a twig seems too loud. In the summer of 2013, I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Minnesota, about 30 miles out from Ely. I was 24 then, and I thought I knew enough about being outdoors to handle myself. I packed light but smart: tent, sleeping bag, food sealed tight, a small hatchet, a knife, a flashlight, and my old hiking boots that were falling apart but still clung to my feet like second skin. It was late July, humid but not unbearable, The kind of weather where the sun makes you sweat by noon, but the nights still creep cold enough that you pull your sleeping bag tighter around your shoulders. I'd parked my car down a dirt road that cut into the forest, walked about 4 miles in until I found a clearing near a small creek. The ground there was even enough to pitch my tent, but far from any obvious trails. That was the point. I didn't want to hear anyone else's voices out there. By late afternoon, I had camp set up, a little fire going, water boiling, and a rough spot cleared of sticks to sit. The creek trickled about 20 feet off, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like wet iron mixed with pine sap. It felt good to be cut off, though there was always that strange edge to the silence. You get so used to background noise, distant cars, neighbors, even appliances humming, that when you strip it away, your brain starts filling the gaps with little alarms. Every snap in the undergrowth felt sharp. Every gust of wind sounded like something approaching. I told myself to get used to it. It was just the woods, nothing more. As the sun went down, I ate some dried food and watched the fire shift from orange to deep embers. The forest around me swallowed the light quickly. It was one of those nights where the moon doesn't help much, just a dull glow behind thin clouds, so the trees looked like black walls against the sky. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and laid on my back listening to the fabric crinkle when I shifted. The smell inside was a mix of canvas and earth from the ground below. Sleep came in waves. I'd drift off, then wake at the smallest noise. Once it was the creek gurgling louder than I remembered. Another time it was a low snap from the woods, like a branch breaking under weight. I told myself it was a deer. Probably was. I forced myself to keep my breathing steady. Sometime deep in the night, though, I woke up hard, not groggy but alert in an instant. There was no clear sound at first, only that kind of pressure you feel when something's close by. I laid there, ears straining. Then I caught it. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves just outside the tent. Not the scattered steps of an animal darting, but a heavy tread, one step at a time, pausing between like it was waiting. My heart hammered against my ribs. The air inside the tent felt stale. I didn't move, barely breathed. Another step, then another. It circled halfway around, close enough that I could see the fabric of the tent dip slightly inward when whatever it was brushed against it. I thought about my knife in my pack by the entrance. Too far. If I moved, whoever or whatever it was would know I was awake. The steps stopped behind me, maybe 3 feet from where my head lay. Silence dragged out so long that I thought maybe it was gone. But then I heard a soft scrape, like metal against wood. It was so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. My throat was dry. I stayed still, counting my breaths, waiting. Minutes passed, at least it felt like minutes. Then the steps started again, slow, moving away this time. I listened until they blended with the normal creaks of the forest. Even then I didn't move. I laid awake until the first light seeped gray through the tent fabric. When I finally stepped outside, the air was damp and heavy. The fire had gone cold, leaving only blackened chunks of wood. I checked the ground around the tent, and that's when I saw them. Bootprints. Not animal tracks, not random indentations, clear human boot prints pressed into the damp soil. They circled the tent, stopping at different sides, like someone had been standing there, studying it. The size looked bigger than mine. I felt exposed instantly. The trees around me didn't look the same anymore. They felt like walls closing in, hiding whoever had been there. I kept scanning between the trunks, waiting to catch a flicker of movement. Nothing, just the same heavy quiet. I thought about packing up right then, but it felt like if I rushed I'd make noise, and if someone was still out there, they'd know I was rattled. I forced myself to move slow. I boiled water, pretended like nothing was wrong. All the while my stomach twisted so tight I couldn't eat. After a while, I packed my tent, strapped everything back onto my pack, and started walking. I didn't take the same path back. I cut through thicker brush, branches slapping my arms, thorns tugging at my pants, because the idea of walking the same open trail I'd come down felt like an invitation to be followed. Every 20 steps I stopped and listened. Once I swore I heard movement behind me, faint and steady, like someone keeping pace. But when I looked, nothing, just shadows under branches. Took me almost twice as long to get back to where I'd parked. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the dirt road, I felt like my knees might give out. My old Honda sat exactly where I left it, sun beating on the hood. But there was something wrong. Mud smeared on the driver's side door handle, like someone had grabbed it with dirty hands. My chest tightened. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing moved. I got in the car fast, slammed the locks down, and just sat there breathing. The woods around me were quiet in that same heavy way, but I could feel eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them. When I finally started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life was almost too loud, bouncing off the trees. I pulled out and didn't look back until miles down the road when the forest thinned and gave way to open sky. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't stop replaying it. The steps circling the tent, the scrape of metal, the boot prints, the mud on the handle. It was too much to brush off as nothing. Someone had been out there, moving slow, watching me while I lay trapped in thin fabric. Someone close enough to touch the tent. I told myself I'd never camp alone again, and I haven't. Even now, years later, when I wake up at night to some noise outside, my mind goes back to that night in the woods. Not to animals, not to storms. Just a faceless shape standing in the dark, waiting, listening, circling. And the worst part is knowing I'll never really know who it was or why they stopped there. I went hunting alone in the fall of 2014, deep in the wooded hills of northern Michigan. I was 27 at the time, and I had been going out into the woods since I was a teenager, usually with friends or my uncle, but this trip I wanted the quiet. I wanted the stillness of being on my own, to test myself a little and to just step away from everything for a few days. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off around noon, loaded my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and headed into the trees. The air was crisp, not freezing, but cold enough that my breath made a cloud with every exhale. The leaves had already started to change. Reds and oranges clung to the branches, while the ground was covered in a blanket of dead leaves that crunched under my boots. It had rained the night before, so the smell of wet earth and damp wood was heavy in the air. The ground was soft in some places, but as I walked deeper, it turned into that noisy, dry crunch that makes you feel like every step is announcing your presence to everything living out there. I hiked about 3 miles in before I picked a spot for camp. It was a clearing, not too open, but big enough that I could set up my small green tent without feeling boxed in. There was an old fire ring made of stones, probably left behind from other hunters or campers years ago, and I decided to use it. I dropped my gear, took a swig of water, and started gathering wood. After setting up camp and getting the fire going, I walked a half-mile farther north with my rifle to scout for signs of deer. I found some tracks in the mud near a narrow creek and noted the direction. I sat for a while on a fallen log, listening to the woods. The quiet of a place like that is never really silent. There's always something moving. The wind shifting branches, a squirrel in the leaves, the faint tapping of a woodpecker far away. But even with all that, the woods still feel empty in a way that makes your skin tighten, especially when you're alone. As the sun started sinking, I headed back to camp. The fire was still smoldering, and I fed it with more wood until flames caught again. I cooked a small meal on my little camp stove, just a packet of noodles and some jerky, then sat against a tree while the fire popped and cracked. The forest darkened quickly. By the time the last light was gone, the woods felt like a wall of black around me. My firelight only stretched a few feet before the trees swallowed it, and beyond that, it was just emptiness. I don't scare easily, but being alone in the dark woods will always make you alert in a way you don't feel during the day. Every sound takes on a sharper edge. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and tried to get some rest. I had a small lantern inside, but I shut it off after a while, wanting to save the batteries. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire outside had burned down to faint embers, and the air was colder. What woke me wasn't a dream, it was sound. I could hear the crunch of leaves outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the camp. Not the quick skitter of a raccoon or the light scamper of a rabbit. These were heavier, human heavy. I lay there completely still, my ears straining. The steps circled, stopping, then starting again. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached quietly for my rifle, which was beside me, and held it across my chest. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the sounds drifted away. I stayed awake until the first faint gray light of dawn came through the nylon. When I unzipped the tent, the ground outside was disturbed. Leaves were shifted, and faint prints marked the soil near the dying fire pit. They weren't clear enough to tell much, but they were boot prints, not animal. Someone had walked into my camp during the night. The hairs on my neck stood up, but I tried to push it down. Maybe it was another hunter, maybe someone lost. I tried to rationalize it. I made coffee, packed my rifle, and went back out to the creek area. I hunted most of the morning, saw nothing, and came back around noon. My stomach dropped when I saw it. My backpack had been moved. It wasn't where I left it. Nothing was missing, but it was shifted a few feet, the straps twisted like someone had picked it up and set it down again. That afternoon, I didn't hunt. I stayed in camp, sitting by the fire, scanning the woods. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something was pressing down, like the trees were holding their breath. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. By nightfall, my nerves were raw. I kept the fire big, flames reaching up, throwing sparks into the dark. I didn't get into the tent right away. I sat on a log with my rifle across my knees, listening to every sound. Around midnight again, I finally went inside, zipped up, and sat with my lantern on low. It wasn't long before the steps came back. Slow, steady, circling. My throat went dry. The steps stopped near the tent, just feet away. I could hear breathing this time. Heavy, calm, like whoever it was wasn't afraid at all. They stayed there, just standing. I gripped the rifle so tight my hands ached. I didn't unzip the flap. I just sat there, frozen, waiting. After a long time, they moved again, the sound fading into the woods. I didn't sleep, not a second. When daylight came, I packed everything as fast as I could. My fingers were stiff, clumsy, but I forced them to work. I stomped out the fire, loaded my gear, and started back down the trail. Every step, I looked over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, not just quiet but hostile, like they wanted me gone. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost ran. The relief that washed over me as I unlocked the door and tossed my gear inside was overwhelming. But then I saw something that chilled me worse than the night sounds. On the back window of my truck, written in the grime and dust, was a single word: stay. I don't know who had been out there watching me. I don't know if they followed me in, or if they'd been camping nearby and decided to mess with me, or if it was something darker. But I do know this: I've never hunted alone since. I still go into the woods, but always with someone else, never by myself. The silence of the forest isn't peaceful to me anymore. It's a reminder of those footsteps circling my tent, of that heavy breathing, and of the words smeared into the back of my truck that told me everything I needed to know. Someone had wanted me to stay, and someone had been close enough to touch my truck while I was out in those trees. And I'll never forget it. I was 25 when I decided to camp alone in the English countryside for the first time. It was the summer of 2016, late July, and the weather had been surprisingly dry for a week straight. I had been staying in a small rented flat in Bristol at the time, but I needed to get out of the noise of the city and spend a couple of nights under the stars. I had borrowed a decent tent from a friend, packed my sleeping bag, a small camping stove, a lantern, and enough food for 2 days. I didn't choose an official campsite. Instead, I picked a quiet patch of woodland not too far from a small village called Castle Combe in Wiltshire. It was the kind of place where you'd see more walkers and cyclists than cars, and where the sound of the wind through the trees was louder than the occasional hum of traffic. I parked my car on a narrow gravel pull-off by the road and hiked about half a mile into the woods, carrying my pack. The air smelled damp and earthy, a mixture of moss and decaying leaves. And there was that deep silence you only get in English forests, where you can hear the flap of a wood pigeon's wings echo for what feels like forever. I found a clearing just wide enough for my small tent. The ground was soft but dry, covered in pine needles and leaves. The first evening went as I expected. I set up camp slowly, taking my time, making sure everything was in its place. I cooked a simple meal on my stove, boiled pasta with a packet of sauce, and ate while watching the lights sink through the canopy. By the time it was dark, I was already zipped inside my tent with my lantern glowing faintly. I read for a while, then lay there listening to the forest. I fell asleep to the sound of owls calling in the distance. The next morning, I woke up around 6 a.m., the tent warm from the early sunlight. I made tea, stretched my legs, and spent most of the morning walking the trails around the woods. I saw a couple of dog walkers and an older man cycling by the edge of the road, but no one came close to my camp. That's exactly how I wanted it. By afternoon, I was tired, sweaty, and content. I lay on my sleeping bag with the tent flap open, looking out into the trees. It was peaceful in a way the city never could be. It wasn't until that evening that things started to feel strange. Around 8 p.m., just as I was finishing a small fire to keep warm, I noticed movement deeper in the trees. At first I thought it was a deer. The woods were quiet, but I could clearly see a figure standing between the trees about 30 or 40 feet away. It was a man. He wasn't walking, just standing there. His shape was half hidden in the shadows, but I could see his head tilt slightly, as if he was looking directly at me. I froze. My first thought was that he might be another camper or maybe a farmer from the nearby village. But something felt wrong. He wasn't carrying anything. No bag, no torch, nothing that suggested he was out for a walk. He was just standing there in the half-dark. I tried to act casual, even though my chest tightened with unease. I stirred the fire, pretended I hadn't seen him, and after a few minutes I glanced back up. He was gone. The woods looked normal again, but I couldn't shake the image. I ate quickly that night, barely tasting my food, and put out the fire earlier than planned. I got inside the tent and zipped it fully shut, trying to reassure myself. England wasn't a place where you worried about dangerous people in the woods, at least not usually. But I couldn't sleep properly. Every small sound outside made me jolt awake. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even the wind shifting. Around midnight, I heard something more deliberate. Footsteps, slow, uneven footsteps moving through the undergrowth near my tent. My mouth went dry. I held my breath and switched off my lantern, lying still in the dark. The steps grew louder, then stopped. For a full minute, I heard nothing. I imagined the man standing there again, just beyond the thin layer of fabric that separated me from the night. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent to look. Eventually, the sound faded, Whether he walked away or was still standing there silently, I couldn't tell. It took hours before I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, maybe an animal. I made tea again, forced myself to eat breakfast, and tried to shake the thought away. But when I stepped out of the tent to stretch, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt and pine needles just a few feet from my tent were footprints. Clear, unmistakable footprints from a pair of heavy boots. They circled the tent once, then stopped at the back, where the ground was softer. Whoever it was had walked around me while I was inside. I decided then that I wouldn't stay another night. I packed slowly, trying not to look like I was rushing, even though my skin crawled. I kept glancing over my shoulder into the trees. Nothing moved, but I felt watched the whole time. When I finally shouldered my pack and started the hike back to the car, the woods felt different. Every sound seemed sharper. The quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy, like something was hiding in it. I reached the gravel pull-off after half an hour and felt a wave of relief when I saw my car. But the relief didn't last. Stuck under one of the wipers was a folded piece of paper. My stomach turned before I even touched it. I pulled it free with shaking hands. It was a page torn from a notebook. On it, written in messy handwriting, were 4 words: "I watched you sleep." That was it. No name, no explanation. I didn't look around to see if anyone was nearby. I just threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and started the car. My hands were shaking so badly on the wheel I could barely turn out onto the road. I drove back toward Bristol without stopping, checking the mirrors constantly, expecting to see someone following me. I never reported it to the police. At the time, I thought they'd laugh, say it was probably some bored teenager playing a joke. But the footprints around my tent and the note under my wiper weren't a joke. Whoever it was had been out there in the woods with me, watching. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, years later, I still think about it whenever I see a quiet patch of forest in England. The thought that someone stood in the dark, only a few feet from me, watching me sleep, it never really leaves you. And I know for certain, no matter how much I try to reason it away, that there was nothing imaginary about that man. I was 28 in the summer of 2013 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Maine. I had just left a long-term relationship, and I needed the quiet. I wanted to be cut off from the usual distractions. No phone, no traffic, no people, just trees, dirt, and fire. I picked a spot near Moosehead Lake, but far enough from the main camping areas where most families stayed. I didn't want the sound of kids running or car doors slamming to break the silence. I wanted to be on my own, maybe a little too much on my own. The air that first day was thick with pine and wet soil. The ground was still soft from rain the night before, and I had to kick at the dirt to flatten an area for my small tent. It wasn't fancy, just a 2-person tent I had used a couple of times before. I set it up about 30 yards off a trail I had followed in, far enough where I couldn't see the path from my spot. I wanted privacy, but looking back, I realized how hidden I really was. Nobody could have seen me unless they were looking hard. The first night was uneventful. I cooked ramen over a small stove, watched the sky fade into deep blue, and listened to the lake water brushing against the rocks. I felt calm. I crawled into my sleeping bag, and for the first time in months, my head wasn't racing with stress. I drifted off to the sound of crickets and the occasional loon out on the water. The second day, I hiked a little further north, following deer trails through the thick woods. I carried only water and a snack, no phone, no GPS. I trusted my memory and the natural landmarks, which was a mistake. At one point, I had to stop and really focus on where the lake was in relation to me. I felt that small panic rise, the one that comes when you realize you might be turned around. Luckily, I found a familiar log I had stepped over earlier and followed the same line back. It rattled me enough that I didn't go as far the rest of the day. I cooked again, this time rice and beans, and spent the evening by the fire, staring into it like it was a TV screen. Everything was quiet except for a light wind moving the trees. That night, something changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound. At first, I thought it was just branches creaking, but then I heard footsteps. Slow, steady, heavy enough to press the ground. I froze in my bag, my body stiff and hot with adrenaline. My first thought was a bear. I had my food sealed and hanging from a branch about 10 feet off the ground, so I knew it wasn't inside the tent with me, but the sound was too deliberate for an animal sniffing around. It was paced. One step, a pause, another step. It circled my tent, or at least that's what it felt like in the dark. I didn't move, didn't breathe heavy, just kept my ears sharp. After maybe 5 minutes, it stopped. The silence afterward was louder than the noise itself. I lay awake until dawn, not daring to unzip the tent. In the morning, I told myself it was a deer or maybe even my own imagination half dreaming. I stepped outside, looked for tracks. The soil was soft, but I didn't see much, just patches of disturbed pine needles that could have been anything. Still, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. I almost packed up right then, but pride and stubbornness kept me there. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared. That third night was worse. I sat by the fire later than usual, the flames making me feel less alone. The woods seemed thicker than before, like the trees had shifted closer. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder. Every little sound, the snap of a branch, the rush of a bird, made me jump. When I finally got into my tent, I laid there wide awake, waiting for something, and it came. The same footsteps, only closer, more confident. Not an animal. I knew it this time. Whoever it was, they stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, faint but steady. Not huffing like a deer, not snorting like a bear. Human breathing. I held my knife in my hand, blade tucked under my sleeping bag. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might be loud enough to give me away. After what felt like hours, the sound drifted away again. My mouth was dry, my skin cold even in the bag. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was done pretending it was nothing. I knew someone was out there. Maybe they had stumbled across my camp. Maybe they had followed me from the trailhead without me noticing. But they were there, and they knew exactly where I was. I debated leaving right away, but it was already midday, and the hike back was long. If someone was really watching me, packing up in broad daylight would show them I was spooked, maybe even vulnerable. So I stayed one more night, though I hated myself for it. That last night, I didn't bother with a fire. I didn't cook. I didn't even zip my bag all the way, in case I needed to move quickly. I sat in the tent with the knife across my lap, listening. Hours dragged on, the forest groaning and whispering with wind. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slower. Whoever it was didn't circle. They walked straight toward the tent and stopped. I could see the shadow against the thin fabric, tall, unmoving, just standing there. I didn't blink. My knife dug into my palm from how hard I gripped it. I thought any second the zipper would move. It never did. They stood there for maybe 10 minutes before walking off. This time, I waited only a few seconds before I acted. I shoved everything into my pack without folding it, tore the tent down in under 2 minutes, and slung it all on my back. I didn't care about noise. I turned on my headlamp and walked the trail fast, almost running. My legs ached, my chest burned, but I didn't stop until I saw the gravel lot where my car sat. By then, dawn was breaking, and the sky was a pale gray. My car was the only one there, empty, silent. When I got inside, I locked the doors, sat there shaking, and finally let myself breathe. Whoever it was never showed their face, never spoke, never touched the tent. But I know what I heard. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. Someone who had no reason to be that deep in the woods in the middle of the night. Someone who didn't light a fire, didn't make a sound, just watched. I don't know if they were waiting for me to fall asleep, if they were building up the nerve to do something, or if they just wanted to scare me. All I know is I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps were real, the shadow was real, the breathing was real. I never went back to that spot. I still camp sometimes, but only in open areas with other people nearby. I double-check the trailheads, scan the parking lots for anyone hanging around. And no matter how tired I get, I never, ever ignore the sound of footsteps in the dark again. I was 24 years old the summer I decided to drive out to northern Arizona on my own. It was July 2011, and the heat in Phoenix had been crushing me for weeks. I'd been working long shifts, my head stuck between office walls, and I wanted a break where I could just disappear from everything. I packed my tent, a sleeping bag, a small cooler with water and food, and I drove out toward the high desert, where the pine trees break up the dry dirt and red rocks. By the time I reached the camping spot I had marked on the map, it was already evening. The sun dipped behind the tall pines, leaving streaks of orange and pink across the sky. I set my tent near a cluster of trees, far enough from the dirt road to feel alone, but not so deep that I couldn't find my way out. The air smelled different there, sharp with pine sap and a kind of dry, dusty earth smell that only comes from the desert mixing with forest. The first night passed quietly. I sat near my little fire until the logs turned to glowing coals, listening to crickets and the occasional rustle in the trees. The silence of the woods at night always felt heavy, like the trees were leaning in close. But I didn't feel afraid. I slept hard, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're worn out from the road. The next day, I hiked a few miles, following an old game trail that ran along the ridge. The heat rose fast after sunrise, and sweat clung to my back as I moved through the tall grass and dry brush. At one point, I spotted movement across the ridge, about 200 yards away. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the way it moved made me stop. It walked on all fours, then stood up straight for a few steps before dropping down again. I figured maybe it was just the distance and the heat waves playing tricks on me. I turned back after a few hours, my water running low, my legs scratched up from thorny branches. That evening, I built my fire again, cooked a small meal on my little camp stove, and sat back in the folding chair I had brought. The woods around me were darker that night. No moon, only a slice of light on the horizon. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a sound coming from down the slope. It wasn't the usual sound of coyotes yipping or the low hoot of an owl. It was a sharp, broken noise, almost like a person coughing or choking. Came once, then again, closer this time. I froze, the hair on my arms lifting. I killed the fire right then, covering the flames with dirt until the glow disappeared. For almost an hour, I sat in the darkness, my back pressed against a tree, waiting to hear more. The woods were so quiet that even the snapping of twigs far down the ridge carried up toward me. Eventually, when nothing else followed, I crawled into the tent, unzipped the bag, and laid down, though sleep came in short, shallow pieces. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a noise outside my tent. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. The steps were heavy enough to press into the dirt but careful, pausing every few seconds, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I reached for the small hunting knife I had stashed by my bag, gripping it tight, my hands slick with sweat. Then, I heard something that froze me completely. It was my name. It came from just outside the tent, low and drawn out, the syllables stretched in a way that didn't sound human. The voice was broken, almost like it was learning how to form the word. I had never felt a fear like that in my life. I wanted to run, to burst out of the tent and tear through the woods until I hit the road, but my body wouldn't move. I just lay there, gripping the knife, waiting. Minutes passed. I didn't hear more footsteps, and the voice didn't come again. But the silence was worse. Every second dragged, and the only sound was my own shallow breathing inside the nylon walls of the tent. By sunrise, I forced myself to unzip the flap and step outside. The ground around my tent was disturbed. At first it looked like animal tracks, but they were wrong. They were too long, almost like a human footprint, but stretched, bent at odd angles. I wanted to believe it was just my tired mind exaggerating what I saw, but the dirt was clear enough. Something had walked in a wide circle around me, again and again. I told myself I was done. I packed up my gear in record time, stuffing everything back into my pack, collapsing the tent with shaking hands. By 9 in the morning, I was on the dirt road, my car loaded, and I drove fast, too fast, back toward the main highway. But something followed. I noticed it about 20 miles down, when the road curved along the ridge. In the mirror, through the dust trail my car kicked up, I saw movement in the trees. Something keeping pace, ducking in and out of view. I thought maybe I was losing it, my nerves shot, but then I saw it again, tall, thin, moving on 2 legs, then dropping to all 4s in a way no person ever should. My chest tightened, and I pressed harder on the gas, the engine whining as I pushed the little car faster. It didn't stop until I hit the highway. Once I was on the blacktop, surrounded by the blur of other cars, the presence lifted. I kept looking in the mirror for miles, but nothing followed anymore. I didn't stop until I reached Flagstaff. I parked in a crowded gas station, surrounded by people and noise, and sat there for a long time with the engine off, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. I never went back to that camping spot. In fact, I haven't camped alone since that summer. The outdoors still call to me sometimes, but the memory of that night, the voice trying to shape my name, the twisted footprints in the dirt, and that thing pacing my car, stays sharp in my head. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't the dark playing tricks on me. Something was out there, something real. And whatever it was, it wanted me to know it had found me. I was 27 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Black Hills of South Dakota in the fall of 2014. I had always liked being out in the woods, away from the noise of town and the constant static of everyday life. I picked a spot not far from an old service road that wasn't used much anymore, maybe 2 miles off it. The forest there was thick, mostly pine, with uneven ground and patches of rock that jutted out like bones under the earth. The air smelled sharp, like dried needles and damp soil, and the silence had a weight to it that pressed down on me the further I hiked in. By the time I set up camp, the sun was already fading low behind the hills. My tent was small, just enough for me and my gear, and I pitched it on a flat clearing where pine needles had built up in a thick layer. I laid down my sleeping bag, set up my small propane stove, and ate a quick meal of beans and sausage from a can. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional pop of tree limbs shifting in the cooling air. I wasn't uneasy at first. I'd camped enough times alone to know the usual sounds of the woods at night, the way the wind can make the branches groan, the way animals move just beyond sight. But when full dark came, it was different. The air got colder than I expected, sinking hard into my jacket, and the stillness grew heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. Around 9, I stepped a few yards from the tent to relieve myself. My headlamp threw a weak cone of light across the trees, making the shadows sharp and deep. That's when I saw it. Something pale between the trees about 50 yards out. At first I thought it was just a dead trunk or maybe a rock that caught the light, but it was too tall and narrow. I froze, squinting into the dark. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that it wasn't just part of the forest. Whatever it was, it stood still, tall and upright, and I couldn't make out any details. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there for maybe a full minute before looking down for a second, convincing myself it was just a tree. When I raised my headlamp again, it was gone. Nothing there. Just black trees swaying faintly with the night wind. My stomach tightened. I finished quick and went straight back into the tent, zipping it closed, telling myself I was only tired, that shadows played tricks. But I didn't sleep well. Every creak outside felt louder, every gust of wind harsher. At some point, maybe midnight, I heard the crunch of leaves close to the tent. Not an animal skittering, heavier than that, slow and deliberate. Step, pause, step, pause. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out the noise for a second. I held my breath, straining to listen, gripping the small knife I kept near my sleeping bag. The steps circled the tent. Not rushing, not careless, just moving slow around me. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't call out. I just lay there, still as stone, knife in hand, praying it would pass. After what felt like forever, the sound faded into the distance, swallowed by the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat there, staring at the nylon walls of the tent, waiting for morning. When the first light finally bled through the trees, I got out. My legs were stiff from not moving all night. The ground was damp, covered with dew. I forced myself to check the area around the tent. First, I saw nothing. Then, about 10 feet away, I noticed the ground was disturbed. Pine needles and soil shifted, pressed down in clear footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, large ones. They led from the trees straight toward my tent and circled it before heading off deeper into the woods. I crouched down, staring at them, my stomach twisted tight. They weren't animal prints. They were human, bare human feet on cold, uneven ground in the middle of nowhere. I felt a wave of sickness rise up in me. Whoever it was had stood there, walking slowly around while I lay inside, helpless. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack, not caring if it was neat or not, and started back toward the old service road. My head was on a swivel the entire time, scanning every shadow between the trees, listening for movement behind me. The woods that had seemed peaceful yesterday now felt hostile, like they were watching me. The hike back took almost 2 hours, but it felt longer. My mouth was dry, my heart hammering the whole way. Every snapped twig made me whip around, but I never saw anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. When I finally reached the service road, I didn't stop. I walked fast down it, almost jogging at times, until I reached my car parked in the gravel pull-off. The relief that hit me when I saw it sitting there was so strong I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I had trouble turning the key. As I pulled away, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But no one did. The road stayed empty behind me, winding out of the forest. By the time I hit the highway, the sun was fully up, and the world looked normal again. Cars passed, people went about their day, and it was like none of it had happened. But it did. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I never camped alone again after that. I still think about those footprints sometimes. Bare feet in the cold, circling my tent in the dead of night. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't out for a hike. They were watching me, close enough to touch the thin nylon walls between us. And the worst part is not knowing why they left. Did they get bored? Did something scare them off? Or did they just decide to wait for another night, another camper, Someone else who wouldn't see the pale shape in the dark until it was too late?